I could hear an audible sound of water running and rushing like a river. That's when I asked Jesus, what is that sound? And he said, this is the river. You're in the river. And in that, he was healing me and he was restoring some things in my heart and in my mind. It was just incredible. I can't even put into words, I think, some of the feelings that you get when you're in that state. But you just don't forget it. It feels more real than the real world we're in right now.
Hello, thank you for tuning in. My name is Nella, and welcome to my podcast, ETHEREALITY. TJ, thank you so much for being here today. Why don't you go ahead and tell us about your near-death experience?
Thanks, Nella. Thanks for asking me to come along and share this. I had a stroke back in October 2022. At the time, I was just out in public at a mall running errands with my daughter, and my legs started to drag, and then heaviness started coming down my right side, so I just knew something was up. We ended up going straight to the hospital. So I was probably at the hospital within half an hour, 40 minutes of the initial event. And in the world of having strokes, the one thing I just emphasize to everyone is if you have something weird happen out there, just get to hospital, because time lost is brain lost. And once the brain tissue has died, you don't get it back. So the quicker you can get to hospital, you're going to save your brain and some of the worst aspects of a stroke from perhaps playing out. Yeah, we get to hospital and everything just started to kick off. I started seizuring. My daughter was with me. She sort of witnessed all of this awfulness happening to her mum. At that time, they did a CAT scan as well, just to kind of confirm what they thought was happening in terms of the physical and what they could see, and then, what was actually happening in my brain. So they took a CAT scan, and when that came back, they concluded that it had a TIA, which is a transient ischemic attack, what they call a mini stroke. But then they also said, by the way, we found a brain lesion as well, completely separate from the stroke itself, but we need to have a look and investigate that as well. So that was another sort of bit of bad news I was digesting that afternoon. Then I got admitted, and then the second day I had another stroke. And because I was in hospital, it was all on. Doctors came rushing in. That second stroke is what really started to shut things down, and I was going into paralysis on my right side, losing my strength. Seizures were happening. It was all pretty awful, and you're just kind of dealing with it as it's happening. I went through a series of tests and then ended up being admitted to the stroke ward.
How were you feeling during this? Were you really afraid?
I was pretty calm, but when you start getting layer after layer of bad news like that, you start to lose your composure. I'm a fairly calm person generally, and I think that's one of my superpowers. I stay calm in situations of crisis. But when we got the news about the brain lesion, that really threw my husband, because he was like, my wife's having a stroke. Has she got brain cancer? What are we dealing with here? I had this moment before I ended up on the stroke ward where I felt like fear was coming at me, the external force of fear. I'm a believer. Jesus is my superpower. And I just called on him and fear left, and I felt it very tangibly go. And from that moment on, I didn't feel like fear was part of the journey. I was still dealing with stuff. I was still having to process it. Physically, things were not looking good. But I'm so glad that fear didn't become a layer that I was also dealing with while I was in hospital and then in the post-recovery as well.
Yeah, it sounds like quite the relief. I mean, it's interesting that you recognized consciously that fear was external from you.
Yeah, and I think some of the life lessons I've learned just on my faith journey and with just, dealing with people and their experiences and their stories, I've recognized that a lot of the things that we grapple with and deal with as humans come at us from external places. In my world, what I believe in God, Jesus, the Holy Spirit, and then, of course, there's a dark side to that, the source of where these things comes from, that's really interesting when you start figuring that stuff out. and being able to literally recognize it and then push it out. Just, sorry, you don't get to be a part of this. I just felt a sense of peace and calm right through that hospital experience, even though everyone around me was amazed. I was so calm and peaceful and having all of these kind of insights and revelations. While my husband was thinking, is my wife going to be in a wheelchair? Is this going to be my life, looking after my invalid wife? That hugely changes the dynamic in a marriage. Him being a caregiver, me being the patient. So those are the kind of things that you're trying to process as the intensity of the medical situation is still unfolding. By the time I got to the stroke ward, they confirmed they did an MRI, and the MRI shows you that this was a stroke. It wasn't just a TIA, it was a stroke. There was a part of my brain that is dead and no longer has brain cells that work. The rest of your brain is then having to work really hard to try and make up and compensate for that. And so that's where fatigue and all those other things come in. It was night 6, I think. It was Halloween night. And again, I could feel the external forces of things going on within the hospital. It literally felt like demonic forces had been released that night. There was this massive storm. And then there was lots of distress happening across all of the hospital wards because I could hear the call bells going off all night. And I was just like, no, sorry, you don't get to enter this ward in this room and throw that nonsense at me. So, I just had this experience where I could feel my heart just slowing down and I could feel my breathing just slowing right down. And I'd actually been pondering, my mother had died only a few months earlier. And when you're in hospital, you're thinking about a lot of stuff that's coming at you. I just felt the sadness about her loss. I want to see her. I want to, see where she is. Is she okay? She was a believer, and as far as I was concerned, I thought, you're in eternity, you're in full joy, you're all good, but it would be nice to have some kind of visual assurance on that. Jesus just kind of came to me when I was in this state of everything kind of shutting down and said, do you want to see your mum or do you want to see me? And at that point, I said, I want to see you. That's kind of like, for a believer, if I get to see Jesus actually, not just in a thought or an imagination, that's pretty significant. So he just came to me. He was there, and we were in this place of blueness. It sounds kind of weird when you try and explain it, but it was a place of pure peace and calm. We didn't sort of rush through a tunnel and sort of go upwards. It was just entering into this space, and we started to just have this kind of communion, this talk without physical words, but understanding each other's thoughts and asking questions. And then he showed me some things in heaven and eternity and in that realm. I didn't want to go anywhere at that point.
Do you remember any of the conversation that you guys had?
Yeah, I do. And some of it relates to personal family matters, dynamics, relationships that have been part of your character and personality. And maybe some of those aspects of your character and personality need to kind of be a bit more refined, and you need to let go of some things. There was conversations around that related to me personally. It was very reassuring, really peaceful to be in that place. I didn't really want to come back into my broken stroke body. When he then asked me the question, do you want to go? As in, leave this earth, go. And I was really tempted to just say yes, because the thought of being an invalid and having to go through all the recovery and the difficulties that come with it, when you're in this place of just sort of peace and everything's amazing and there's Jesus and now he's starting to show me things, why would I want to come back to earth, which is pretty sort of broken and messed up, and our pain and strife and trouble that we deal with? It was very tempting to say yes. The thing that, I guess, stopped me from completely crossing into and not coming back was my daughter, and thinking about my daughter and not wanting to leave her without a mum.
What did he show you about heaven?
So what I saw and also what I heard, it was initially the sound. Like when I was in this blue kind of atmosphere environment with Jesus, it was beautiful, sort of Cinderella powder blue color. He then showed me this part of heaven, which, having known what's some of the bits that are in the Bible, there's some verses in Revelation that relate to the river of life, a river that flows from the throne of God down the east side, and there's trees on each side for the healing of the nations. I kind of knew that as an actual scripture, but when you see it and when you experience it and when you actually are there, it's quite different. It's something like it's ingrained in your memory. You'll never sort of forget that moment and how you felt and what you saw. And it was the sound of the water that I heard. And this was an audible sound. It wasn't just something in my head or in this realm that we were in. I could hear an audible sound of water running and rushing like a river. That's when I asked Jesus, what is that sound? And he said, this is the river. You're in the river. And in that, he was healing me and he was restoring some things in my heart and in my mind. It was just incredible. I can't even put into words, I think, some of the feelings that you get when you're in that state. But you just don't forget it. It feels more real than the real world we're in right now. That's how it feels when you're there. Again, there's that sort of temptation to just stay and remain in that place of eternity. But I felt that I couldn't leave my daughter, and I felt like my job wasn't done. There were still things perhaps for me to be accomplishing or getting done on this earth. So I said, no. And then there was this unfolding experience of the river and the sound. And I did have a vision of my mum in heaven as well. And that was really special to me because that connected to a dream that I'd had 20 years earlier when my father passed away.
Did you have that dream after he passed away?
No,
It was
before he
before it?
passed away. It was like God gave me a little clue and a comfort as to my dad's eternity. Because he had Alzheimer's, he was going into mental decline. You sort of lose your parent before they're gone, and there's a lot of grief that goes with that. I had this dream where my dad was standing on a hill in a heavenly space with a beautiful outlook, mountains, rivers, just, beautiful outlook. And he's standing on this beautiful big grassy hill with me as his mind's shutting down. And he's saying, I'm worried. What's he going to remember about me, our family, all the things that, we've shared as a family? The Lord said to me, it doesn't matter what he forgets or what he remembers. Just know that he is mine and I love you. And I woke up from the dream. And then here we are 20 years later, and I have this experience of the river and seeing the city of God in the distance and the trees and Jesus and all of that. And then he shows me the same hill with my mum and dad together. And she's running up the hill, looking all young and gorgeous again, because when I last saw her, she was in her 80s, she was frail, everything was, failing and shutting down. And it was very comforting to see her with my dad on the same hill, even dressed in the clothing that she would have looked her best in, sort of the early 1960s, the kind of groovy skirts and glamorous hair, sort of 50s, 60s, the picture of seeing her at her best and with her beloved reunited in heaven. And so that was very comforting for me as well. After that river experience and the trees and seeing the city of God from the east, I kind of felt myself kind of, I guess, reconnecting into my physical body, because it's like your spirit's just taken you somewhere else. You feel like you've gone into some other space or realm. After all of the intensity of that, I sort of felt like there was that reconnection back, body and spirit. And there I was in a hospital bed, just pondering all this amazing wonder that I'd just sort of seen and felt and heard. After that, it felt like that level of revelation the Lord gave me from seeing parts of heaven and having this experience. It was like the level of revelation I was then picking up from things in the spirit just felt so much more heightened. Like my husband would come in and visit me, and I'd be sort of telling him about this experience, and he was like, wow, people don't know what to say. They're kind of like, they're blown away and they're amazed by it, and they sort of understand it, but it all still seems a bit mysterious to other people. But when you experience it yourself, it's not mysterious. And now when I hear other people's experiences, because I hadn't been a person that sort of followed a lot of near-death experiences, and I didn't have some kind of script, this is how they go, having read a few stories and just watched a few clips on YouTube, there's some definite similarities as to what people seem to see and experience as they kind of go into this other realm. And I think for me, probably the most significant thing was the feeling of choice that the Lord gave me. I didn't feel like he was snatching me away unwillingly. He gave me a choice. The God I know and what I understand of my faith journey so far, it's about our free will, us being able to make those choices of our free will to either follow him or not follow him, to, do what's right or not do what's right. I felt that that was the pattern that I have as a believer and a follower of Jesus, that he gave me that free choice. Just this year in February, I lost my sister very suddenly. And it was a sudden death. It was unexplained. We had to go through a process of a coroner, pathologist. There's a whole process that goes on when there's a sudden death that they cannot determine the cause of. And this only happened 6 months ago. About 2 months ago, we sort of got to the end of finding out what happened to my sister when she died suddenly at home. No known medical causes or events underlying that. When I heard that the cause of her death was a stroke, I sort of felt I went through that, and here am I, alive, recovered, and living life, and able to tell my story. And she just fell asleep and didn't wake up. And then we find out, they say, it was a stroke that took her out. And I was like asking the Lord to make sense of this for me, because it hits really close. The same awful medical event happened to both of us within a fairly short space of time. It was like he took me straight back to my near-death experience, and he said, remember, I gave you a choice. He showed me that he came to my sister and where she was at in her life and gave her that choice. And she said yes. And he took her, allowed her to just leave this earth and join him in eternity in a way that was very peaceful. Falling asleep and not waking up, it's probably about, the best outcome most of us would want in terms of death. It doesn't involve pain or trauma or drama. But yeah, so I'm sort of still processing my way through that a little bit, because that is very close to home for me. Having gone through the stroke, recovered from, the physical effects of it, oh my gosh, I actually had a near-death experience, and here am I to tell the tale. But here's my sister who made her choice, and she's no longer with us. So, it's been a hard year, in that respect.
Somebody else I interviewed had said something that I hadn't thought about, but it seems so obvious, was that all death is ultimately unfolding as the near-death experiences do. And there's certain scenarios where somebody's not going to have a choice. Their body was beyond returnable, and then like elderly that are like really done. But to think of all the people that we lose, and we always think that it's just this unfair, unjust thing that has occurred, but to think that that's what they wanted. They chose. They had exposure to something so astonishing, something that gave them a sense of fulfillment and love, like that purity of love. They chose that. And who could blame them?
No, I totally understand it, having kind of been in that place of perfect peace and love and joy and sort of revelatory knowledge. I certainly don't question it. It makes me not question what I believe. I'm really solid in what I believe in terms of my faith journey and who Christ has been in it, and God's love for me and my family and different things I've experienced along the way. But these parallel experiences I've had of my own stroke and then my sister's stroke, and two different outcomes, because of the different places we have been in life. I think there was real beauty in my sister's release into heaven, because life for her was very difficult. I think staying here would have caused a lot more pain and despair than, entering into full joy. I haven't had a picture of her and mum and dad in heaven. I haven't sort of felt the specific reassurance of that myself yet, but I'm open to it, and I look forward to the day I do get that snapshot of what that's like for them.
Were you raised in the Christian faith?
Kind of, yeah. I was one of those families where my dad was an atheist, like hardcore, staunch atheist, argued faith, God stuff constantly with my mother, who became a believer when I was quite young. So I do remember going to Sunday school and learning Bible verses and learning, Bible stuff and feeling a real sense of happiness and joy about all of that. And then hitting my teenage years, kind of throwing it all out for a period of time, doing my own thing, sort of parking that faith stuff. And then at the end of my teens, having a moment where I came back to it because I could see my life tracking in a direction that was not particularly great. And I knew the outcomes were going to be sending me down a path that probably didn't want to be in. So, yeah, I came back. I came back to my faith and I sort of recommitted. So from my late teens, early 20s, my faith's now, 30 years old. Yeah, there's a lot of experience and understanding that I personally have witnessed and been a part of in my own life and in the life of other people. To me, I find that very encouraging, comforting. When you're dealing with these situations of trauma and stress and death and loss, that you have something to hold on to. You have an anchor that gives you a sense of peace or reassurance. Because when you lose a loved one, literally your whole world is upended. We all have to go through it in different ways, whether it's sometimes predictable, a medical situation that slowly shuts a person down. So in a way, family can prepare for it. But when the finality of it happens, it's still grief and loss. Or whether it's the sudden sort of, awful car accident death. None of us know how that's going to play out, but how do we find some meaning in it? How do we find some sort of comfort in all the little broken pieces of how that's affected our life? That's where I find what I know and what I've experienced of my faith and my journey into the things of God has brought me great comfort. At times I've been able to share that comfort with other people. If this conversation in some way encourages someone in their journey, that's a great outcome for me.
How do you reconcile the things under the umbrella of mainstream Christianity with what you know now about the other side?
I don't see it as a conflict at all.
There's a lot of killing and edifying of war, and especially in the First Testament, there's just so much
Sort of
murder.
brutality. Yeah, sort of punishment, judgment stuff going on.
And that's
Yeah.
hard for me to believe God is encouraging, or was encouraging. Jesus came to like set that straight and be like, okay, stop doing that, right? But I don't know.
Yeah, I know what you're saying. Yeah, I read bits of the Old Testament, I just think this is puzzling to me. But having experienced God's love, that to me solves the puzzle of some other things that my mind hasn't quite unpacked or understood. And that's where, when you actually get into study, pull apart bits of the Bible and understand the historical context of what was happening at the time and how the improvements that were happening through some of that part of history was God's attempt to try and pull humanity forward into a better kind of path. And ultimately, Jesus was that path. I guess that's how I could explain that.
Yeah, I don't see myself as mainstream Christian. However, I do believe everything that Jesus said, stood for, and did. Yeah. So that's why I asked that question, is because I have a really hard time personally with a lot of things in the Old Testament.
Oh, yeah. I think most of us do, because it does sound so harsh and brutal and judgment and strange sacrifices and all that stuff. There's actually an American guy called Shane Willard who's really good at unpacking that stuff and explaining it in the context of history and Jewish culture and all that stuff that was forming in those early days. And I found him very helpful. He talks across all the different streams of faith, the Catholics, the Presbyterians. He's invited everywhere because I think he just has a gift in being able to unpack that stuff. Okay, I can understand how that makes sense. Yeah. Because if we just
Interesting.
look at it as words on a page and think, oh my God, all these people got slaughtered and then more people got slaughtered. Culturally, there was a lot going on at that time. Yeah, this guy, Shane Willard, if you just Google him, you'll find him. He was
Shane
helpful.
Willard.
Willard. Shane is an Shane. Willard, Willard.
Willard. Okay.
I can't speak into someone else's near-death experience, and I can't sort of say it was real or not real or right or wrong. What they experienced is what they experienced.
Right.
And, I'm sharing my experience. That's all we can do, really.
You said that your husband was receptive when you were telling him what happened, but a
Yeah.
little stunned, maybe.
My husband was just really surprised and kind of a bit blown away by me explaining part of this near death experience to him. Parts of it, you don't fully unpack it with everyone because some people aren't going to be able to receive this. They're just not going to understand it. He understood it and he didn't in any way doubt what I had experienced or heard or felt or seen. He's got his own personal faith journey and walk, and he was leaning into that while I was in hospital because he was grappling with this whole is my whole world just changing on me? Invalid wife, stroke recovery, is this my life? And he was grappling with all that while I was grappling with the recovery physical aspects of it. Yeah, that's the other bit I didn't quite cover. And that was the bit that falls into the category, as far as I'm concerned, as being a miracle, a medical miracle. So, right back at the start when I'd had the CAT scan, and they said, yeah, I think you've had a TIA and you've got a brain lesion. So, there's two different things going on there. We need to explore them. When they did the MRI and they came back to me with the final discharge when I got discharged on day 10, which is pretty unheard of in the world of people who have strokes to be out of hospital in 10 days, because there's a lot of rehab and physical stuff that generally takes a long time to get through. And I had this rapidly accelerated sort of healing journey going on. When they gave me the discharge papers, they had noted what had happened, the stroke, what it meant, what part of my brain, what that was doing in my physical body. And there was no mention of this lesion, this brain lesion that they'd found. And there it was on a CAT scan. And so I asked about that. And that's when they said, oh, we couldn't find it. It doesn't appear to be here. So within a 6-day period of having had a CAT scan to then having had an MRI, this brain lesion had gone. Of course, the doctors were like, we don't have an explanation for that. So my explanation was that God healed, performed a miracle to remove whatever that lesion was. I didn't want to be dealing with brain cancer on top of a stroke. So thank God. And I feel very thankful and grateful that that particular issue just got dealt with supernaturally, miraculously. Doctors like, we don't understand this. We can't explain it. We can't explain how you're recovering from your stroke so quickly. We don't see this. So there was all that going on in that 10-day period in hospital, which was really intense, but at the same time, it was really amazing to have sort of gone through that journey and come out the other side with all of that experience and understanding around that realm of the supernatural, miracles, meeting Jesus, seeing heaven. I mean, it's a lot. You then have to get back into your everyday life, but you hold on to that because that's very precious. Sometimes there's times to share it, and other times you don't.
If you're getting any value out of this podcast, please hit that like button and subscribe. Also, if you've enjoyed my content before, or maybe you're new here but you like it, drop a comment and let me know you're here. I would love to get to know my audience. Thank you for listening, and let's get back to the content. Was there anybody you tried sharing it with that completely rejected it?
No, I haven't had a complete rejection of it, but I have had some people look at me with that puzzled, skeptical look on their faces and think, really? Wow. It's like they can't quite get their heads around it. But I think that's where your sense of discernment comes in as to who you share it with and who you don't. Because, some people are just not open. They're not open to hearing things that might actually freak them out a bit or might make them question perhaps something about their lives or their beliefs. What does happen when we die? Those big questions. I don't share it with just anyone. It's something that is precious and personal to me. So the fact I'm sharing it here on an open forum in a podcast, that's a bit of a big deal because it's a personal thing you're putting out there. And of course, people will have their own views and opinions around it, and they might just think it's crazy talk, but I don't really care if people think that.
Same.
Yeah.
Neither do I. Did you ever personally doubt the validity of your experience?
No, not at all. A heightened sense of all of your senses when it was happening. And then that sense of coming back into your body and like, oh, wow. And then here I am in a hospital bed processing what just happened. But yeah, I don't doubt it at all. Some people might say, well, maybe you're on some really strong drugs. Maybe, because I know when people are going through surgery and things like that, you do end up having some strange hallucinatory kind of moments. But I wasn't on any medication of that kind at any point through the entire experience. I was pain-free. And that was another thing that was really interesting for me, great for me, because I know a lot of people who have strokes. Yeah, you go into paralysis and things shut down, you lose muscle strength and all that. But a lot of people also experience pain. They have muscle spasms and they have parts of their body that they never get back. They don't get functioning fingers, they don't get the ability to walk or, walk without a limp or assistance. The fact that I literally got full recovery of all of my senses and functions of everyday living, I'm really thankful for that because I know a lot of people who do have strokes do not experience that kind of recovery and their life is very limited because of the physical damage that occurred in their brain, which then affected their body, and their ability to look after themselves and be independent. So, yeah, I'm very thankful that I was given that gift of life, of a miracle, of a near-death experience, all sort of bundled into this short period of time.
What would you say looks different about the lens in which you experience life through now after your experience versus before?
I think one thing I have noticed is I've had some other friends and family going through some big medical stuff that's happened and unfolded. And I definitely have more of a sense of empathy and understanding around the trauma of going through a big medical event and what that's like for people. We can never walk a mile in someone else's shoes. I don't even think we can have a sense of understanding sometimes, but a compassion for, a compassion for someone who's suffering through something awful and it doesn't seem to be coming right or the outcome's really tragic. And I think that's kind of honed and sharpened my sense of that for other people. Hopefully, it's made me a kinder person in the way I relate to other people. Right now, I have a friend who's in hospital recovering from something pretty bad and things are not going well. I've been able to comfort her through that because of my own experience, and she can kind of relate to what it's like having to recover from something that's taken you out.
So you shared your near-death experience with her?
Yeah, I did. I did right back near when it happened. She's a good friend of mine. She's a woman of faith and prayer, and she just was like kind of amazed as I was sharing the story. And then now here she is in hospital experiencing some things. I can kind of relate to that and give her that sense of comfort. This too shall pass. You will come through this. It's awful right now, but we travel through it. There's hope, there's healing, there's us being able to get back to our lives. It's not just this hospital bed, these things that are going on, and the sense of helplessness that can come with being in a state like that. that it's not the end. I hope I am able to give people hope around that and maybe inspire them to feel more of a sense of God's peace and love around them in those times of trial. Because if we don't have a sense of comfort and love in a time when we're going through something difficult, it's really awful for us as humans, I think. We want to be a part of having that support from friends and family. And for myself, those layers of spiritual experiences I've had are of great comfort to me. If that helps someone else along their journey in some way, that's all I can ask. Yeah.
So what inspired you to start sharing your experience publicly?
When I was in hospital, the 10-day intense period, at that time, I felt like the Lord was saying, this is a story to share. And I was like, yeah. And because it all seemed so sort of, at the time, very five-dimensional and vital, and it was all just so clear in my head, I was like, yeah, I should be sharing it. And then I get home and I still have to recover. I still have to go through some rehab and put my walking back and all these kind of things. And in the midst of all that, you're just having to work hard to kind of get your life back. I didn't have the mental space or energy to share it earlier, I don't think. And then this year, having had my sister die suddenly, going through that process and getting to near the end of it and realizing she didn't get to tell her story. Her story got cut short. Whereas, sorry,
It's okay.
yeah, I'm here, and I'm able to tell my story. And if that helps someone else, that's a good thing. Yeah, and then it was literally me stumbling upon someone's YouTube clip, which was the other side NDE channels, just randomly popped up in my feed one day of a woman sharing about how she had a stroke and how she had a near-death experience and some of the moments and revelations of her experience. I'm listening to it and just thinking, oh my gosh, that's what happened to that's what happened to me. And I at the time I kind of thought, oh, I think it's time. I think I meant to just share the story in a way that wherever it goes or whoever listens to it, if that becomes a part of their journey that encourages them, that's great. And, I just sort of want to bless them with that because, this is the beauty of social media and all the technology we have today, that we can literally share stories across time, space, and geographical locations, and it's easy. The reach of these things, you don't know how far or wide it may or may not go. That's the risk of sharing something publicly because people will throw whatever opinions they think about it at you. But I just think I'm not bothered by that. Not bothered by that. I don't need to hide this or think it was crazy or just share it to a select little number of very trusted people. I'll just throw it out there into the wider world, the universe, and there you have it.
That's wonderful. I'm so glad you did.
Yeah.
There's so many people out there that have had their own near-death experience and need the validation because so many people are so quick to reject those sorts of experiences.
Yeah.
Because they're scientific mind or they're skeptical. And it's a time now where we have a space that is safe to come forward and talk about it. Within these communities, it's a safer space than not.
Yeah.
Because of how many people have come forward. And the more that do, the larger that safe space becomes.
Yeah. 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 And, people have these experiences across a whole wide range of faith positions, spiritual positions. There's a whole wide world of people that have now shared publicly these kind of things. And yeah, I just find it really fascinating the times that we live in, that there's an openness to some things and then there's also a real shutting down to other things. We've sort of got this weird dynamic going on at the moment in the world, I feel. But that's the times we live in, so we just got to embrace it, I guess.
Or intentionally shift it.
Yes, that too, definitely. Yeah,
At least that's my
because
goal.
yeah, no, that is true. I've always been quite intentional with my life and the decisions I make in life, being quite a logical person, quite I need to see the proof, research, all that kind of stuff. And then you have something like this happen, and it's like, well, I can't give you any proof. I can't give you any research to sort of back this up. I'm just telling you what I experienced, and that's up to you how you receive it. And maybe that does shift you. Maybe it does give you a better sense of empathy or kindness or awareness of other people and their struggles. Hopefully, we can all collectively do our bit to make the world a better place, because there just seems to be a lot of weird, dark things going on at the moment, as well as people who are really open to wanting to shift and change things.
You're absolutely right there.
The times I have shared this with people, initially it was people that were within my circle of trusted friends, and most of them, not all of them, were believers. They were people that were Christians across a spectrum of Christian belief or denomination. I'm not stuck within a particular rigid, I don't understand the whole denominational barrier thing. But anyway, I felt very blessed and comforted by the fact that when I went into this kind of paralysis shutdown period, and that was on day 3, my husband got on the job and he just got people praying. And I could literally feel their prayers. I could feel the sense of people's prayers when I was in hospital. And I remember sometimes you'd wake at 3 or 4 in the morning and stuff was going down, and might have been your fellow patients were having a terrible time or you were having a not so good time. And then I could feel someone praying. And it just felt like this little wash of peace, and it's going to be okay, and you can get through this. And I remember one morning, I was brushing my teeth. And when you have a stroke, often, your fingers and hands don't work so good for a while. And right side affected, that was my writing hand, my hand that I do most things on. And I'm trying to brush my teeth, holding my toothbrush, kind of like a claw, because my hand's not holding things properly and it doesn't have the strength to. So I'm trying to brush my teeth, holding the toothbrush really awkwardly. And I just had this little thought like, ah, I wish I could brush my teeth better, properly. This is kind of annoying having to brush them in this really awkward, random way. And then I felt someone praying for me. I could just feel someone's praying for me right now. Oh, that's awesome. Thanks for that, whoever you are. And then I could feel my hand getting its strength back. And then I was like, oh, great, I can now brush my teeth properly. And it was just this little kind of connection, because it was like I was picking up things that are happening in that spiritual realm as I was dealing with what was happening in the physical realm in my body as it was recovering. And it was that quickness and that speed of how things recovered was happening through that whole hospital period. I remember one night after that whole big Jesus River Heaven experience, it was maybe the second or third night, I had some music on my phone. It was a playlist of some modern cool worship, and I'm just listening to it and then feeling like I'm entering into that place of worshiping God. And as I'm worshiping God, I'm lying in my hospital bed, putting my hands up. My right side is completely not so good, but as I worship God, I could feel strength just draining back into my hand and my arm, and every time I sort of entered into that realm, I could just feel another layer of healing happening in my body. Here's the doctors coming in every day doing their rounds, and they see me from day 1, and then they see me at day 3, and they see me at day 8, and they're like, how can this be happening? This lady's recovering so quickly. Here's the MRI. Here's the bit of her brain that's dead, and we know she's had a stroke, but the recovery was so quick. To me, that's the miracle of God's love. That's how I relate that he loved me that much. And I didn't do anything to be bestowed a miracle, but he gave me that. And here am I today, able to tell the tale of God's goodness in healing me from this awful stroke medical event, and now being able to just live my life and share that story.
A lot of people who have near-death experiences come back and they have spiritual gifts. The door was cracked, I guess, like to the other side. And there's this supernatural connection, ability to see things, to hear things
Yeah.
that most people don't. And so, do you feel like your awareness and understanding of these prayers
Yeah.
and the effect that it was having on you was a result of that near-death experience opening that door and giving you sort of a supernatural awareness?
I think it's definitely given me a heightened sense of that awareness. I think prior to this event, um, 30 years in being a faith Jesus person, leaning into him for prayer, I had an awareness of it and was kind of moving in that, I guess, and picking things up in the spirit as I'm praying for people. But since the stroke, it feels like that's heightened. And also, there's that sense of, I think, more empathy and compassion that I have for someone who's in a real struggle in a difficult situation. I think before I was not detached, but I didn't have that same level of understanding that I do now. So, yeah, I definitely feel that the gifts that God's given me, He's given me, I think, more tools and more layers to be able to use those gifts effectively. And whether that be in prayer for people, whether it be in the prophetic, being able to see or hear and speak encouragement or that kind of thing for people, and in healing, laying on hands. There's been moments I have really felt that God's given me a gift of healing and to heal others. Well, He heals them. I'm just the conduit to which He comes through. But then every now and then our humanity kicks in and we just think, oh, I'm just an everyday person. We all go through that as well. But yeah, it's like a marker in your life. You have something happen and it's significant and it changes you. And it can either change you for the better or for the worse. I choose for the better, choose for this life and my story to be some kind of testimony that's going to give God the glory and that is going to encourage people to press in and understand what His love is about in the context of their life, not in the context of some Bible stuff that doesn't make sense. I think there's a lot of things in life that don't make sense, and we're all on a journey of trying to understand and help each other along the way.
How do you experience messages coming to you? Do you hear Jesus?
Yeah, there's been times I've definitely heard sentences, words. There's been times I've had recall on a Bible verse, a scripture, and I shared a couple of those in the story of there's one in Revelations that was all about heaven and trees and the river, and then this one in Ezekiel all about the sound of his voice being like rushing waters. To me, that was one way God speaks to me through his word, but also through his person and through his presence. And when you go into that place where you experience the presence of God, and I experienced it in a way that maybe not other people have that level of experience. But, I've experienced the presence of God when I've been in some kind of gathering, some church meetings, some times of worship. There's just been a real intense download of God's love, of God's presence, of the Holy Spirit giving me a sense of encourage that person or speak this word.
How is that much different from being a medium? Or is it?
I think that word has been used at times for people who maybe operate in the gifts of prophecy and the prophetic. A medium, I guess it's two sides of the same coin. There's another realm of the spirit. How do we access that? I don't actively seek to access it for other people, but if God shows me something or gives me something that's going to encourage another person, I'm willing to share that.
Yeah, I just feel like the term itself, it's been adopted by like the spiritualist community.
Yeah.
And I think that it's interesting, spiritualists and what they believe, and Christians, what they believe, they're looking at something that is operating from the same elements, the same concept, yet calling it different things and sort of demonizing the other.
Yeah. There's a realm of the spirit, but not everyone is particularly aware of what that realm looks like or how it operates. And that's, what you've been exploring and why you get people to talk about these experiences. So I look at it from the context of my own experiences and what I feel God has shown me along the way. And who am I to judge someone else's experience?
Thank you for answering that question. I've been challenging you more than I do with most people in my podcast. And I think that that comes from the fact that I grew up in a Christian upbringing,
Yeah.
and there are certain things that I've learned about the time period in which the Bible was put together, the history of the Roman Catholics. After learning all of that information, it was very difficult for me to align with certain aspects of Christianity. But near death experiences gave me a lens where I had realized that what Jesus stood for and
Mm.
the common denominators of hundreds of near death experiencers that I've talked to
Yeah.
are not in conflict with each other. I can believe in Jesus. I can recognize what he stood for and stand behind that, yet
Mm.
simultaneously believe in the validity of the near death experience testimonies.
Yeah. Yeah.
That is so entirely wrapped around love. Everything that
Yeah.
Jesus stood for, everything that people who had near death
Yeah.
experiences stand for is all love.
Yeah.
So I personally have
Yeah.
some questions for near death experiencers who are still identifying as Christian.
Yeah. I don't have the conflict between my experience and my faith. And I guess my thoughts around some of the historical craziness that, like King James, he was such a corrupt, awful king, really. And, that's the Bible that we're supposedly all meant to be, the best interpretation of. And to me, that speaks of man's own inner corruption, people's own agendas, people's own power struggles, their need for more power or recognition or whatever. To me, that doesn't reflect God's love. The Bible, is a series of stories collected by many people over hundreds of years, all squished into 66 books that if you just read it from cover to cover, you think, what? This doesn't make sense. But when you unpack it and study and ask questions of other people who perhaps know a bit more than you do, and then weigh it up, and for myself, just really let that settle in my spirit as to whether I agree with or don't agree with. Yeah, it doesn't, for me, seem a conflict that I had a near death experience and that my faith is still as solid as it ever was. It hasn't made me tip away. The man interpretation stuff of the Bible and faith is what messes it up for most of us. And so you have to kind of boil it down to that pure experience of God's love and how that comes to you and how he reveals himself to us. I mean, I've shared bits of this story with the pastor of my church. He's been absolutely fascinated by it and really open to it. But I think it rattles the theological cage of some people because there's mysteries in the Bible we still haven't figured out. And then, people do things like have near-death experiences, and it's another layer of mystery for someone to try and figure out.
It's often threatening to narratives of Christians.
Yeah.
I have one more question to ask
Yeah.
before we wrap things up. I feel like you have come to the table today to share your story to help people. If you were
Yeah.
to identify a single nugget, wrap it up into like a mission statement, like what is something that you want people to come to understand about the world, about life, death, whatever?
I think having gone through this experience for myself, it's given me a deeper appreciation of what I had known up until that point as the love of God. But I got to experience it in another level of fullness or in another dimension that a lot of people may not ever quite get to for whatever reasons. The other part of the experience that to me was very precious and special was the support that I got from not just my immediate trusted family, friends, and circle, but the wider community. all those people that just got to praying for me that night I was going into paralysis. That was huge, to feel the prayers of however many people just started praying and accessing that realm of the spirit, and then pulling heaven down into my body so I had strength back. That was extraordinary. I won't get to thank or meet many of those people that stood in the gap for me and prayed for me when I was at my weakest and most vulnerable. I thank God, and I thank my husband, and I thank my loved friends and family members who did step up and be strong when I was weak. You know, when you're at your weakest, you want to know that people have got your back, that you're not in this alone. And that for me, that 10-day period in hospital where I felt like I was literally living in the presence of God, in his love, in his peace, and weirdly in his joy. I don't know if people can understand how you can be joyful in the midst of a stroke and how you can be enjoying this experience of revelation when you're going through your physical body just not functioning. But I'm thankful that I went through the experience, and I'm grateful that I got to come out the other side and still be here to share it with people. And I do feel very blessed that I had that experience. Yeah. Yeah.
Your prayers matter.
Yeah, they do.
It's a good mission statement.
Yeah. Yeah.
We'll probably put that on the thumbnail.
Yeah.
Meow. Okay.
Oh, your cat's interrupted you. I think my dogs are waiting outside for me, but are you okay if I just prayed with you?
Oh, yeah, absolutely. I'm gonna mute it because my cat's meowing, but
Yeah, I can hear that.
yeah, go for it.
Oh, Father God, Lord, I just thank you for this opportunity that we have had today to share our thoughts and, in a way, share your love, Father God. And I just pray your blessing upon Nella in this work that she's in. Lord, you've given her this assignment to explore and unpack those things of the realm of the spirit that a lot of people just don't understand. And Father, in us being able to share the stories and tell the stories, I just pray that you are known in the midst of it, Father God. And Lord, I just thank you for Nella and this opportunity that came my way. And I just pray your richest blessings upon her and her life's journey. In Jesus' name. Amen.
Amen. Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you so much for listening to my podcast. If you loved this episode, please consider leaving a review. If you're listening on YouTube, don't forget to hit that like button and subscribe so we don't lose each other. And just share the link with somebody who can appreciate this message. Blessings to you all, and I hope to catch you on my next episode.